We will start with the meditation from the Book of Tokens on the magician, the Hebrew letter called Beth. One and one only am I in essence, changeless, indivisible, concealing within my being the 10 lights of divine emanation. In this mine unalterable unity am I supreme, and none is equal unto me. Yet though I myself remain unchanged throughout eternity, my power doth manifest itself in ceaseless change. They err who speak of my changelessness in essence, as if it were fixity in operation. That which changeth not is mine own nature, but this includeth the possibility of infinite diversity in ways and works. For the uninstructed, this is a stumbling block. Confused by words of double meaning, they perceive not that this mine immutable nature is an essence whose first ground is life, and not mere being. Thou knowest me not, O Israel, if thou regardest me only as he who is. They know me indeed who know that I am he who liveth. I am life itself, and without mind there is no life. I am the essence of mind, and the essence of mind is will. Of my will, all created wills are but reflections, and the essence of that will, what is it but desire? I am life eternal, and I am the eternal longing for manifestation, because of which I bring forth the shining worlds. For this do I divide myself, becoming two. Of these two, the first is the crown of my primal will. This my superior nature standeth above the world which floweth forth from mine act of knowing. Yet even the superior nature is to mine inmost essence as something outside, and therefore is it to me as Beth, my house, for I am within it, and it is an emanation from me. Nevertheless, I fill my dwelling place. Hence it is written that the supreme is distinguished from the crown by name only. In my supreme abode stand I as onlooker. Because of mine unwavering contemplation, the stream of manifestation continueth on its course. Whatsoever existeth hath its beginning in my will, continueth in my will, and by my will cometh at last to its appointed end. Than this indeed there is no other will in all the universe, yet in it do all creatures have a part. From my substance all things derive their substance, and all that hath form is built from my fourfold elemental manifestation. 4 are the subtle principles, which the wise conceal from the uninitiate by the names fire, water, air, and earth. In endless variety of mixture and proportion, directed by my will, these mingle together for the production of forms. They are transmutations of a single essence, and from their mingling are brought forth all things. Watching thus the multiplicity of existences proceeding from my single essence, I understand them in all their relations. I perceive that their beginning, middle, and end is in truth myself. Thus do I see that all things, whatsoever their appearance, because they spring from mine own nature, are grounded in goodness. My superior nature is reflected also in the mind of man, created in my image. Know me thus as the source of all true will. Know me also as the power to perceive objects, as having the appearance of standing outside and apart from him who regardeth them. That in thee which so perceiveth objects, which giveth the power to distinguish between them, which revealeth them unto thee in their relations to each other and to thyself, and enableth thee to search out the laws of their reciprocal action, know this to be identical with my superior nature. Wherever this power acteth, whether in low forms or in high, I only am its source, and I the knower. Not thine, but mine is the power of attention, of observation, of discovery, of the discerning of sequence in the operation of nature. In all this and in the power of discrimination, my superior nature worketh through thee. Happy art thou if thou canst grasp this truth, for then understanding that not thy weak self, but my all-knowing mind looketh out upon the world through thine eyes, shalt thou have faith to let me see. Then shalt thou overcome the evil of thy senses by devoting them wholly to my use. Not thou, but I shall then discern the weight and shape and textures of the things thou touchest. Not thine, but mine shall be the knowledge of scent and savour, gained through nose and tongue. And when I use thine ears for hearing, they shall be attuned to sweetest harmonies, where now they are assailed by strident discords. So shalt thou become a partaker in the bliss of mine experience of the universe, a joy unknown to those of unperfected soul, whose time of realization is not yet at hand. Last week, we gave you a very quick and a very cursory introduction to the way the emanations flow what appears to be downward from the tree, that is, coming from what is called the womb of the no-thing, from the limitless light, from the absolute. This involution of the energy of God's consciousness. And though we could give a long, long course on just that part of the work, this particular group of classes happens to be for the purpose of trying to give you some understanding of the actual ways and means in which the true initiatory processes, the true Rosicrucian methods, handed down from long before even the biblical times, the way that human beings have attained to, shall we say, more than man, and the way which is available here for those who have the perseverance and the aspiration to follow it. Now then, as we pointed out last week, having arrived at a point where there is complete self-consciousness in and through form, the ability to discern the difference between what we generally call I and what seems to stand outside, having gone through the miseries, the unhappinesses of misinterpretation of these experiences by feeling ourselves to be isolated, alone, lonely, something set apart from the whole universe, we become driven by our own higher soul, incidentally, because the time is at hand. We become driven to find the answer to all things. The aspiration starts to burn, and various experience feed this aspiration. We, as we have mentioned before, will often take highways and byways. We will hunt for the easy ways, for the promises which will give us liberation in the 6 easy lessons. And we will discover that the promises are not fulfilled. Some of us keep going this way, perhaps for many incarnations, searching for the easy way. Comes a time we realize there's nothing easier than the actual way. That is, the willingness to put oneself under the discipline of attaining to whatever it is that we want to attain to, even though we perhaps cannot put a finger on it. Then we are guided to what we call the high school, college level of occultism, which we represent, to that which truly trains us in an ability to gain insight into our own subjective states, our own thinking processes, our own feeling processes, to start understanding the amazing power of creativity which we not only have, but have always had, and to start learning how to use this power consciously, very, very consciously. Now, because being involved in these extraordinarily intensive energies, which are utilized in the true mystical schools of occult training, it is very necessary to be able to weed out as much as is humanly possible those who are not truly prepared for such work. Now, many people seem to feel that a lot of the mystery, a lot of the so-called secrecy, is something that should not be utilized by certain schools of occult training. These people fail to understand that this is really a protective device. For example, if a human being has tremendous power drives, and really remember, most people are not yet aware of the things that go on in their own nature, of their real motives. Most people are prone to interpret their motives as pure and the other fellow's motives as impure, to interpret their ideas of spirituality as the true ones and the other person's as delusion if they feel kindly disposed, or if they're not so kindly disposed, as deliberate and outright dishonesty. And just like the one who's conservative in politics will look upon the radical as an evil person, or at least one who is in back of evil things, and the radical in politics will look upon the conservative as one who is behind the evil things and, again, interpret that person as being evil. In the same manner, we have a tendency to judge other people's spirituality, whatever we mean by that. We have the tendency to judge this in terms of what we have decided a spiritual being is. And yet, not a one of us is in such a position, that is, to determine what spirituality actually is, until we have experienced the true higher self, and through that experience have seen into the hearts of men, because only from that level, incidentally, do we truly see. And as an old American Indian adage says, judge no man until thou hast walked in his moccasins for 6 moons. You see. Well, because we do have these mostly unrecognized drives in people. For instance, if you have serious inferiority complexes, they can act out in several ways. One of the usual ways is to attempt to make other people look less evolved or less developed than you are, to look down your nose at whatever it is that they are, because then that helps you to feel big. What do you think makes for race prejudice, for example? Race prejudice is the need to feel better than not only just another person, but a whole group. You see, that makes us that much bigger when we indulge in race prejudice. So we can decide that if we belong to one group, we're something far superior in an evolutionary manner than another, and this feeds the ego. Incidentally, this is the most viciously unspiritual characteristic that a human being can have. So little recognized, and it is, because it is the most separative in every way you can imagine. It is the most separative kind of thinking. It is the most hate-producing kind of thinking, and it does not belong at all in any kind of spiritual work. Yet you would be amazed if you knew how many human beings call themselves occult aspirants and think of themselves as spiritually sensitive human beings. and very glibly talk about the inferiority of this race or that group as compared to their own. And in fact, this in itself is usually a dead giveaway as to what their true level happens to be. I mean, is one of the dead giveaways. So we have people with inferiority complexes who will need to feel better than the other in all sorts of ways. We mentioned the race discriminative angle because this is one of the most vicious. And yet, in subtle ways, the same thing can take place. And it becomes just as dangerous when one starts utilizing the more intensive energy forces. It's like trying to handle the high-power lines, high-power electrical lines, without knowing the safeguards, without having the grounding, stripping bare a part of the line which will electrocute people. So what with inferiority complexes, the power drives, place-seeking, ambition needs, and incidentally, even spiritual ambition is dangerous, because many people think that they are spiritually aspiring, and actually they merely use this to try to make themselves feel better than other people, the spiritual ambition. Even though they may have many other beautiful qualities, this becomes dangerous. Therefore, it is very important to weed out as much as possible those elements which are not ready to safely handle energies which will backfire and, in a psychological sense, sort of electrocute them, if you know what we mean. It's the best analogy I can think of at the moment. So that there has been an attempt by those who are charged with the preservation, dissemination, and teaching of these methods. There has been an attempt made to find the best safeguards possible, and even then, remember, we make mistakes. We're not gods. And our suprasensory perceptions, though we have them, aren't always on tap, like a soda fountain. There are times when one can overlook many subtleties in a person when they're hidden up because they're so hidden from the person himself. And this was so well understood by the masters who set up this system that they did set up this system of graded practices for more than one reason. First of all, this is the way evolution works to begin with. And we can't jump from being a seedling to a full-grown tree. We can't jump from being an embryo to a full-blown man or woman. Everything must go through its stages. And in the process of training the aspirants through these stages, those elements which make one either unworthy, and there are such, or unable to go through the rest of the training, the processes themselves usually weed them out, even when a few mistakes are made. Nevertheless, it becomes ever more important to make as few mistakes as possible, because the energies in the universe really are becoming ever more intensive at this time towards evolution, for evolution, because of the age that we're in, with the population multiplying in such a startling manner, with the entire age of Aquarius being ushered in. There are so many more aspirants who are ready, and therefore there is so much more opportunity for the unprepared to slip in, and thereby, incidentally, endanger themselves, also hurting, to some degree, shall we say, the fraternal body, or the spiritual body of the group, the esoteric group, which is involved in these advancing grades of the true Rosicrucian initiatory practices. So, to begin with, aspirants have to know the basic principles, have to have gone through the tarot techniques, the tree of life techniques, teachings, as you receive in your lessons at home. Because no matter what it is that you want to be, you certainly have to have your teaching, your training for that particular type of work. You cannot be a chemist if you don't go through school and learn chemistry, nor a mathematician if you don't go through school, learn your mathematics. You have to go through the symbol training period, or part of the symbol training period, so that you learn the language of subconsciousness, which is the area in which the most potent and vital part of esoteric work takes place, which you all realize, surely. And therefore, you have to learn the tools of the trade. Otherwise, you're not going to have the trade. That is, you're not going to have what you require, the buds in your consciousness, to experience the levels of consciousness or to handle the energies that go with these levels of consciousness and evolution. That is why the lesson part is really a preparation for the esoteric work. But as we have heard so often, till perhaps we are almost nauseated by it, many are called but few are chosen. We can well understand how few really keep going even on that level of the work. They drop out because they are hunting for the easier ways. And again, because they're caught in the inertia of malkos, which is the bottom part of the tree. This is the part where we're starting backward or inward or upward. Actually, inward is the more accurate term, incidentally. Still, it seems to the experiencing consciousness often, when other levels are experienced, as an upward movement. And it's really going back towards the center, and yet, at the same time, keeping what has been gained from the awareness and the experiencing of consciousness in and through form. So we have then also the proneos, which is the part of the work where the wheat and the chaff get sifted, so to speak. There we have the initiation into what is called the porch or portico or threshold of the tree. There, the aspirants have help in understanding the lessons. There, they have the value of the initiation that they perform together in order to keep them pointed in the direction of that tree, to be open to the forces from those aspirants, those initiates, those adepts who have already gone, some just a little bit beyond, some much beyond where they stand, to receive that help which comes down in forms of subtle energy and gives astonishing aid. Then, when they are prepared, both in what they have learned and have shown themselves as having the qualities which make them worthy of participation in the more esoteric and the more intensive elements of the work, then one by one they are taken into the chapter. Now, here what we want to understand is this. By worthy, it is never meant that one should already have attained all these perfections of consciousness and the ability to handle the mental and emotional states. If you had that, you would not need builders of the adytum at all. You would be one of those who would be serving the inner school and the masters in helping to bring others who have not yet got it into the fold, into the evolutionary stream. into the intensive energies and all that goes with it. It is not expected for the aspirants to have attained these levels. That's what the chapter is for. But it is expected that certain transmutations have already been accomplished, particularly, you see, during the process of pranayas. I hope it doesn't frighten you, pranayans, but in a sense you might say, there's an eye being kept on you. You're being studied, every one of you who are in pranayas, to see how well do you work with a group. Because you see in the chapter, through the initiatory process, it really becomes one body in the subtle spiritual sense for a specialized purpose. Just like God creates the body of a dog in order to specialize consciousness and self-experience as dog. And I think a glorious job God made of it when he made that little dog I had, Sati, you know. He was really doing a magnificent job at that time, according to my way of thinking. And just as God self-experiences himself as Anne through my vehicle, and as you in you, whatever your momentary name happens to be, or as tree through a tree, or a special kind of a tree. In the same way, on the subtle levels, when you have a group working with spiritual powers together in spiritual aspirations, you have a sort of subtle vehicle with a conscious cooperation taking place. Now, for instance, just take your body that you are functioning through now. If your liver stops cooperating with the rest of your body, you're going to be very sick. And if your heart stops cooperating, everything else in the body dies. And if any one of the vital organs stops cooperating, it's a sad thing. You're not going to be able to function through this vehicle anymore in this cycle. You'll have to go on vacation in the astral and then build yourself another vehicle. And it kind of seems like a waste of time. And we've made so many vehicles, and we're learning how to do it in an ever more efficient and effective way, incidentally. This is, again, part of the training process which you are receiving, is learning how to make yourselves more effective vehicles. But you see, in the same way, in the chapter, you have to have those who function well as a group, who aren't going to try to hit somebody else over the head, psychologically speaking, or commit mental murder by whispering behind the back, well, so I can't stand so-and-so because I don't like the way he twitches his eyebrow, or perhaps because he's too talkative, or perhaps because he looks like he's too secretive, or so on and so on. You know the things that we'll find about other people to make us feel that we don't care about them. Well, while you're in pranayas, you're being watched for all the subtle indications of power drives, of inability to function harmoniously with a group, of spiritual pride, and particularly also, incidentally, any tendency towards race prejudice or other group prejudice or fanaticism. No fanatic will make a good occultist. No fanatic's going to get anywhere, incidentally, spiritually speaking, because it's unbalanced. And these important elements are being watched. Now, many of you may have one or more of these elements in the nature. You're watched in the hope that the work of pranayas, the impact of your regular ritual and participation in it, your study at home and your group study, will help you wake up and transmute it to prepare you for entry into the chapter work. Anyway, don't be frightened. Whatever you are or are not, whatever you have or have not, We love each and every one of you because we know every one of us, including those in chapter, have all sorts of traits that need transmuting. We wouldn't be around if it were not so. We do not seek perfection. We only seek certain qualifications, which are really not too difficult to acquire if you work towards it. Then comes the time when initiation takes place into chapter for those who've reached that point. And this initiation, incidentally, gives the initiate, because at this point you are what is called a Kabbalistic initiate. True, you have been initiated into pranayas, but remember that was the portico. So you have had an initiation into a certain probationary stage and state. But this is an initiation into actual participation in the forces of what this tree represents. Now, let's try to explain one other thing at this point, so that we'll understand in what manner this tree represents it and why we will keep referring to the tree and to the paths and what it really means here. Now, of course, I am the last one to speak of maps that give you the all of those intricate drawings, the maps of the roads and the streets and the numbers, so that it'll give you the help you need to go from one part of town to another, or from one town to another town, or from a state to another state, the highways, the roads, the connecting links. Now, anyone who wants to go somewhere usually takes a map, and he studies this map. And the reason I said I should be the last one to speak about this kind of map is because the inertia of malkos has always been so strong in me regarding that particular type of map, that when I get in my car and have to go somewhere and somebody says, look at a map, I look at them in astonishment. And I say, a map? What do I need a map for? I can stick my head out and ask somebody. And it takes less time. And besides, I might meet someone interesting or pleasant that way. Or I'll give somebody the feeling of having helped me, which is good for them. So, you see, I don't like looking at maps. And that's why I'm not good at reading maps. And knowing this, I don't attempt it. However, that is just a little aside to give you an idea of a map in terms of getting from one place to another. I do know that it's important to have maps. And I'm very happy that so many people read them so well, because I just hand it over to somebody and say, read it for me, please. But we can't do that in spiritual aspiration, in traveling the paths of our inner consciousness, in traveling the paths of our own inner states and levels. We can't ask somebody else to read us the map, please. All we can do is ask them to explain what the map means. This is what we do with you in class. This is what you get in your lessons. This is what you get in pranayas, and then in chapter more intensively yet and in another way. So the tree of life, you see, really has been given to mankind by those who have levels of consciousness that are right with the heart of God. Given by those who have traveled these paths, who know the roads, who know what we must avoid, just how to go, when we have to turn right and left, or top or bottom, or backwards or something. Anyway, this map really is a map of consciousness. And it is a symbolic representation of the universal consciousness, of man's consciousness, and of man's relationship to the universal consciousness, man's relationship to man and to all other levels of life and form. That is what this is a map of. It is intricate in some ways, and yet it is simplicity personified in other ways, if one takes the time and trouble to learn how to read the map so that one can follow the directions. That really is the crux of the matter. So The map has to be memorized. Why? Because in the workings of inner consciousness, don't forget, anything you memorize becomes a permanent symbol in the subconscious mind. In actuality, subconsciousness has this symbol. Even an aborigine, even a primitive savage, as well as the most highly civilized man, has this map in subconsciousness. But naturally, he's unable to recognize it, he's unable to read it, just like if you wrote a bunch of figures on a sheet of paper and showed it to a dog. The dog wouldn't even realize there are figures on that sheet of paper, even though you attempted to show it to the dog. The dog hasn't got the awareness, the conscious awareness and the faculties yet to be able to see that he has been shown some markings on a paper. And in the same way, the memorizing of this map, the memorizing of the attributions, the memorizing of the various meanings of each of the sephirot and the paths, gives the consciousness that symbol it can hold on to so that it doesn't go flying off in all directions. All of you know and all of you realize how difficult it is to keep the mind centered on one area, except when you're in love, of course. Then you can't take your mind off that spot. This is real concentration. And sometimes, just for a joke, I've said that it might be that God created love in order to train us into concentration. But in essence, as surely we realize, God is love, and we are, because God's image of himself is concentrated on these aspects of himself, which are you and me and the sky and the tree and the bird, those we hate and those we love. God loves it all because it exists only one place, in the substance of God's consciousness, as we tried to explain to you last week in trying to show the involution as really being an aspect of the motion of God's consciousness within an area of his own substance. Now then, when the initiation takes place, and of course the details of this type of thing cannot be given, because that is reserved for those who go through it, and the impact comes when they do go through it. But what is it? What we want to help you understand is what it is that it aims to do, why it aims to do these things, and furthermore, how you, even now, even those of you who are not yet in chapter, how you can be preparing yourselves to utilize the powers of this tree and these paths by learning how to meditate on the meanings and thereby prepare yourselves that much more effectively for the opening up of consciousness to come more quickly once you are in chapter and have yourselves linked with the rest of the hierarchy of consciousness in this holy and sacramental area of self-development. Well, consider for a moment, before we go into the spiritual, psychological elements involved, what it is that will be stimulated and what you can do to start that process, even in a preliminary manner, at least up to a point. Consider there, when you look at malkos, that lower part of the tree, remember, this symbolizes the actual physical universe in the cosmic sense, and also each and every form, no matter how infinitesimal, nor how large it may be. It is the symbol of the physical form. And of course we will have to discuss a little more of what we mean by physical form, so that we can learn how to think of our vehicle in the way that we must sooner or later in order to get this vehicle sensitized so that it can receive the influx of these higher states of consciousness. If you will notice, malkos is divided into segments. Actually, if you made a time sign, it would be the way that's segmented into 4 parts. And these are symbolizing what the ancients called fire, air, water, and earth. And what the ancients meant by that, incidentally, is the physical substance in its fiery state, that is, the electromagnetic energy state, in its gas state of gas, that is, the elements and the gases which are formed, in its state of fluid, when you come down to any greater condensation from the gas form, and its state of earth, that is, its actual solidity. These are the 4 levels of the one thing in terms of the physical substance, and often you have no doubt heard the analogy given that if you take ice, as ice, it is a solid. Get it in a certain vibratory state, and heat is used in which to change the vibrations of ice, by the way. And actually, that's what happens. The vibratory rate is changed by heat. You heat it down, you get it into its fluidic state. Keep heating that fluidic state, and steam escapes. That's the gas of water, which was ice. And keep heating, and it dissolves itself entirely into the atoms, which are the fiery electromagnetic energies, the dots of fire, you might say, the dots of light. So there you have, in that one simple example, an illustration of the exact knowledge that these ancients had, and which, of course, we now know is true, of just what the physical universe consists of in terms of the physical senses. And, of course, here is where we will be getting into a greater insight into the physical universe as a whole. Now, why does the initiation take place in that and through those symbols, which involve the physical element? Well, remember, it is in and through form that consciousness has evolved. It is in and through form that consciousness knows itself. Even if you die, you have a form, you have your astral form. And indeed, all consciousness is draped in form, although when you come to the highest spiritual rate of consciousness, the form is so subtle that from our physical point of view, we would not recognize it as form. Nevertheless, form it is. Why? Because, as it is taught, God sees himself as all these myriad aspects of being, and the act of seeing is an image. And that is why it is also said God created man in his own image and likeness. All of creation is the self-image God has of self, and the details and the motion of this self-image. This, of course, must become a direct experience for you, and will, when you get to the point in your own evolution where it will open up. And the chapter work is meant to open up, stage by stage, these awarenesses. So you have to start with where you are, and you have to start seeing the form in a way other than you have seen it before, and you have to do it in a disciplined manner. In other words, you really have to go after it. Now, this grade, you see, is each of the grades, the aspirant is given a certain name, or there's a term used to denote the level. And in this particular grade, the aspirant is called the zealoter. Now, what does zealoter mean? This is from the Latin, zealous. And in essence, it is meant to fan the flame of aspiration to such a degree. This is also being done in pranayas, by the way. But here, far more intensive energies are being utilized, even than in pranayas, to fan the flame of aspiration to as intensive a degree as possible. Why? Because you see, the inertia of form holds us back. It's our own inertia at all times that holds us back. And we have to have enough of this fire of zealousness stirred in us so that we will not be fooled by all the subtle ways that inertia comes in with which to fool us, so that we will stay as we are or remain where we are, or start hunting for the easy ways in order to avoid having to truly work and study and concentrate, meditate, and so on. I see that it is almost time for our intermission, so before that I will ask the Reverend Prasan to come up and give you a few announcements, after which we will have about a 5-minute intermission to get the blood circulating. Then we'll continue with an explanation of the grades and what they mean to you. Okay, you want to close this off then? All right, let's have a 5-minute intermission. Stretch, get blood circulating. Now, actually, initiation into the chapter has not yet, incidentally, brought one into the functions of the intensive forces of malkos yet. In essence, you might say that initiation is in two parts. There's a certain period of time which is spent in learning certain things, and certain tests have to be passed. And after these tests have been passed, these things have been learned, then comes the advancement into malkos. The initiation gives the neophyte, and in actuality for that first period of time, the initiate is called a neophyte. It gives the neophyte the privilege and the help of participating in the motions of the tree, which has to do with the ritual and ceremonial that goes along with this work. Now remember what we have said to you before. The rituals and the ceremonials are set up symbols in motion, which are exactly in accordance with the motion of the universal forces and the motion of consciousness, and is aimed at bringing into subconsciousness that more potent force or factor which will stir and awaken it into responding to the higher directive impulses. You all know what problems you have with your subconscious patterns, and you perhaps, at least we hope, you are all familiar with the idea that that wonderful psychiatrist, Dr. Jung, brought out, the discovery of the archetypal unconscious, which incidentally he discovered through Kabbalah, in case you don't know it. Oh yes, he became very, very favorably impressed with the whole Kabbalistic and incidentally also astrological elements of the ancient psychology, because astrology is really the ancient psychology, even though in modern times most people have just taken it as a sort of fortune-telling device. And indeed, the true essence of esoteric astrology is included in this work. As we told you before, the true Rosicrucian paths of return involve all the methods that exist on this planet in one synthesized and balanced whole. so that each one of these planets, or sephirith, are assigned to a zodiacal element, as well as each one of the paths in between, which we will explain to you. And of course, in Malkos, we're dealing with the planet Earth. That is, with our own immediate environment and all the esoteric ideas involved with it, that is, the mental, spiritual background which makes us experience what we call Earth. And this, of course, we gradually learn. We don't have to learn anything all at once. It's just that if we keep at it and persevere, much to our astonishment, in a few years we are amazed at how much we have gathered. And then we start to realize that the secret of true concentration and meditation is in having a group of symbols all pertaining to one idea. This is what holds our attention and helps to open up the inner gates of consciousness. Otherwise, when people try to meditate on just, let's say, God, if they're natural mystics, without question, they may have some very beautiful spiritual experiences, but they will not be able to utilize this for a real explanation of life, of form, of control, of orderly expansion and conscious cooperation with the entire evolutionary scheme of the cosmic life. They will have found something that gives them a great deal of comfort, and it can be, and almost always is utilized by these mystics as an escape valve, not too different than morphine, as we've told you before, except that it doesn't cost any money, so it's cheaper. But it's used as an escape valve, and no aspirant can, in the final analysis, escape from the disciplines of becoming conscious co-creators with God. This is our destiny. And even though some of us may have the comfort of certain spiritual states, if we're natural mystics, by meditation on, say, God, and it's good, there's nothing wrong with it. Nothing at all. It's very fine and should be utilized by those who have the gift. At the same time, there's far more involved than that. We are the sons of God who must claim our heritage. And claiming our heritage involves becoming masters of the elements, incidentally, as was Jesus, and as have been and are many others since. So the initiatory process brings about a potent and incidentally permanent link between the initiate, the aspirant, and the inner school, that is the third order. And this does not mean that this link guarantees that in this incarnation the aspirant is going to make the full grade. It does not mean that at all. Each human being is on a different level of self-awakening and evolution, even in a thing like the chapter. And for some, it takes a great deal longer than for others to awaken to the import of what has been occurring inwardly. This we have seen with great interest through many, many years. But the point is that this link having been established, even if a person has been foolish enough to take such an obligation with motives secret and not recognized, that have not been of the higher kind, even if that person breaks his obligations, he cannot break the linkage that was made. And what it does then is bring far more intensive problems for a while in order to drive that soul and that personality back to the proper motive and the proper idea. But this happens very rarely indeed. Still, it can occur. The motive is of most vital importance. Then the first part of the probationary element of initiation actually into chapter having been accomplished, the tests having been passed, the advancement then is made into the actual consciousness of malkos. Now then, what does this involve? Here we're getting to the actual essence of what is intended and what does occur, though with some it takes far longer than with others for the realization to become self-conscious. The linkage, each grade incidentally, forms a link, a new link with another element or level of the cosmic mind and its cosmic activity. And the advancement into malkos forms the link with what we call the soul of the earth. The soul of the earth, because incidentally the earth has a soul, and you and I live in the soul of the earth and derive our livingness from the soul of the earth. We are individualized, it is true. Nevertheless, remember what we have said before and what we will say many, many times. We may be individualized, but we're not separate. It is like a whirlpool is a distinct whirlpool. Say the energy of consciousness sets up a whirling pool in some water. Just use your imagination. There's water that comes in from the without, and then it goes out from the within. The whirlpool remains constant, but the elements that enter in and go out are in continuous change. This is true of your body, your physical body, and mine, and all bodies. Even science has come to the recognition of this principle, known, of course, to those who have gone before us long since. Even science tells us now, as many of you have heard me relate, that in about 10 months, every single atom in our bodies is gone, and new atoms have taken their place. Because we are emanating out at all times just by virtue of activity and taking in. We share each other's physical bodies and we do not even know it, just as well as sharing the processes of thought and of feeling. And yet we are individual, because there's a center in us that is continuous. In other words, that which is our true ego, our true selfhood, keeps holding the self-image, which is eternal, from forever to forever, that in us which says I. Nevertheless, the substance of this I is shared with all life, with, in fact, all universal life, not just the life of this planet, the substance of it. And it is our self-image that keeps us in a state of continuous image of self as having remained as we were, but we haven't. What was your body like as a child? What was it like 10 years ago? You haven't got the same elements in it today, but your consciousness has been a continuous stream. What was your personality like as a child? What was it like 10 years ago? And what is it like today? Your personality has been in continuous change, but something in you has been constant. That is your eternal I. That is always there with whatever motion and change takes place. Well, in malkos, and in fact this happens with each of the grades, in a sense you might say a seed is planted in your consciousness. Those who have gone before participate, of course, in the initiation and the advancement. And remember all of this linking up with the various levels of consciousness, with the motion of the subtle forces of the universe. This seed that becomes planted is naturally planted in consciousness. The impact of what lies behind the appearance is made, even though the conscious mind of the aspirant is not yet aware, because the seed must burst its shell It must be nurtured. It must send its roots into the earth for its stability. It must send its shoot up into the air. It must grow itself, its tree, and its fruit. And that takes time, but the seed has been planted. That is the important thing. And so in the advancement into malkos, the seed is planted, that of giving you the closer linkage with the world soul and with what it involves. The fanning of the aspiration, as we have told you, is part of it to help you overcome the inertia of form. Not to do away with form, but to become the controller of form. This is the first step. The linkage having been made with this world soul, although it takes varying periods for the varying aspirants, what I can tell you about myself is that although I had been a city girl all of my life, I suddenly, and I didn't know what was occurring, because in actuality, one doesn't really wake up with a really vast inner realization to what has been occurring until one reaches a higher grade on the tree, because so many things are sort of put in to the ground at once. It seems like at once, even though it is a periodic factor, that before it opens up into a conscious realization, as we said, it usually takes a certain grade on the tree where the majority of aspirants start seeing a significance, a tied-in element, an interrelationship, and yet some will see it far sooner than others, and with some it may take a great deal longer even. That should not be anyone's concern. The important thing is to work with the seed and give it its nourishment. But with me, what happened to me was I suddenly developed this tremendous compulsion to put some seeds in the earth. And at that time, the little garden we have was nothing but a mass of weeds and hard clay-like dirt. It was a terrible-looking place. I was always busy working on what I felt mattered, and it never occurred to me to put any attention or waste my time with the garden when I was working on spiritual things, don't you see? But I developed this compulsion to put some seeds in the ground. And so I picked up some little bags of seed at the store, and I hunted around for some bare spots. That'll show you how much I knew about growing things. The fact that there are bare spots in a yard full of weeds shows that nothing wants to grow there. But that seemed to me like the logical place, and I got a little trowel, and I dug about 2 inches, just enough to get the seed there. You see, the whole thing hard clay. And I put the seeds around and did a little watering in about 4 or 5 spots, bare spots, around the yard. Kept on with my work, and several times a day I'd rush out and give it some water and examine it and meditate on these little bits of spots which I marked off with a few little stones, since I wouldn't have known where they were otherwise. And then a miracle, a real miracle. I discovered little green shoots coming up in several of the places. And you would think I was God Almighty himself, which I felt like when I saw those green shoots coming up. I got so excited. It's a wonder I kept my friends, because everyone who came to see me was led by the hand to look at my green shoots. And I'd excitedly practically be jumping up and down, saying, look what I've done, you know. Anyway, a very interesting thing developed from this. The push got deeper and deeper. Deeper and deeper. And I said to myself, I've got to spend a little more time in this yard and make it look nice. And so I started trying to pull up the weeds. I figured if I put in half an hour a day, in about 3 to 4 months, I'd have all the weeds up. To spend the rest of the time with the work. So I got out there. My first half-hour stint I had set myself. You see, I didn't even realize the disciplines of malkos were stirring me. I didn't realize it.
I started to pull up some weeds, and then the neighbor on one side said, "What in the world are you doing?" And I said, "I'm pulling up weeds." They said, "Well, ye gods, how long do you think it's going to take you?" I said, "Well, what does it matter? A half hour a day, several months. I'll get it done." So she said, "This'll never do." And she called her husband. She said, "Look what she's doing. Why don't you give her a helping hand?" He said, "All right." So he came in and started to pull weeds with me. Then she couldn't stand it. She came, pulled on the other side. Then their two sons thought, "Gee, that looks like fun." So they came and joined. Then my neighbors on the other side, I said, "What are you doing?" We said, "We're pulling weeds." She said, "Thank God, your place has looked horrible. I'll help." She got in there. And do you know, believe it or not, that whole yard was cleaned out in one day. Praise the Lord. And I got busy, and I got a whole bunch of magazines on growing things, and it was just all Greek to me, really, but I felt like I was being very clever, and I was just having a wonderful time, because you see, something strange had happened to me. I'd get down there in the earth, and I felt the livingness of it. I actually experienced the livingness of earth, and I myself one with it, and it with me. And when I would dig up a worm or two, you may think I'm crazy, and if I am, I hope I'll always be that way. Only don't spread the word. It isn't good for the leader of an occult movement to be spoken of as being wacky. So let's just keep it to ourselves. But I would take a look at these little worms wriggling in their livingness. And I tell you, I just loved them like nothing I can describe. I felt at one with them. Living creatures. The living creatures. I went into an ecstasy. You think if you've ever been in love and if you've gone into an ecstasy over your beloved, you should have seen me with those worms. Talk about an extremeness. And the flowers, and the watering that I did. And the flowers became living beings to me as they grew. But the earth, particularly at that stage, the rest a lot of it came later. But to me it was more or less the earth and form itself. I became so sensitized to form, I'd find myself looking at it and studying it and being overwhelmed with the miracle of it. All form started to radiate to me a sense of God, and I didn't realize what was occurring at all. It's just that I've decided, a city girl had suddenly discovered nature, so to speak. And then there were other inner subtle things that were involved with my whole feeling about Earth and about the planet itself and such. Well, that's what happened to me in that grade, though I didn't realize its significance until I was much farther along in the work of the traveling of the tree in the chapter. But if I had had nothing but that, it would have been worth all kinds of incarnations to me, to have that rapture and ecstasy of feeling my oneness and the livingness of the earth. Before that, a form was a form, and of course still, except when one gets into that real receptive state, a form is just a form. No matter what we experience, we have to keep working with it or we will lose it. Everything atrophies. And this is part of the lesson of this grade, to realize this. Again, the reason for the development of the zealousness, of not letting go. And I know I have heard others say, when I have related this one little incident, I'll tell you of others as we go along the various paths. I have heard some say, "Oh heavens, well I wouldn't need the chapter. I had that experience. I was a farm girl, and I had that experience before." But you see what such people, if they have said it and felt it, and I know two such who did, don't realize is that if they had that much before, how much more they would have had with chapter, because then a deeper layer would have been opened up to them, because there are layers upon layers. And anyone who says, I already have it, really needs to have their heads examined, because there's no such thing as having it. Whatever there is, there's always more. It's an eternal unfolding and expanding of consciousness with more powers, more glory, more wonder, and more control as it's involved. So a certain period of time, of course, has to be spent then in the grade of Zealotr, which has been an actual advancement into malkos. Now here, though, is another thing that we need to point out that has to do with all of the grades, but each involves a different or separate element. The basic teaching is, as you have heard me say before, there are the four worlds. They're called the four Kabbalistic worlds. And Absolute, the highest or innermost world, is the world of abstract ideas. And to that is assigned the actual aspect of God. So each of the Sephirith, incidentally, in each of the world have what is called a God name. They have an archangelic name, and that is in the next world, called the world of Bria, and this is the creative world. They have an angelic name, it's like the hosts of angels, and that's the world of Yetzirah, which means the formative world. And then they have what is called the mundane chakra, or that is a physical living element, like in this case we told you the world soul is involved in the earth. And it is called the mundane chakra because various planets or heavenly elements are involved there. That's why, and remember that the 7 holy chakras in Kabbalah are the 7 holy planets. And this, incidentally, has more truth than poetry to it, because if you will consider that we are at one with the universe, those things we experience as the physical bodies of the universe when we look out through a telescope, like the other planets, we may be experiencing them through our sight in that way, but there is a magnetic link in consciousness which we participate in. And that's why this whole solar system is something that we are connected with magnetically in very intensive ways. This is part of the opening out and expansion of consciousness, incidentally. Now we are attempting to expand our individual consciousness into the world consciousness. From that, it will be into the solar consciousness step by step. From that, incidentally, in the solar consciousness is really the Christ consciousness, that yellow place on the tree. Then from that, it expands out into the universal consciousness, and it's a step-by-step expansion. And we must, sooner or later, come to the point where we do take these stages, even those of us who have experienced certain states of cosmic consciousness in the mystical inner experiences, because those states have not given us the controls yet, and the controls we must develop and have. That's why many, a very highly evolved mystic from, say, the East, reincarnates in the West in order to go through the disciplines of form and start gaining the controls that these higher states have made him aware of as far as just experiencing the unity. And incidentally, for such, it's sometimes more difficult. It depends on the type, of course. And none of us know what we've been in the innumerable incarnations we've had and what we've accomplished. We feel that those who come to our work have accomplished a great deal in past incarnations, whatever the appearance now. Some people think because you become a king or a queen or a president of something, why, this means that you're something great, and if you happen to just be a housewife or a dishwasher, that it means you're something less. Nothing could be less true. The state and evolution of the soul has nothing to do with your outer station in life. And sometimes those who have the highest outer stations have the lowest evolutionary factor, and when we look at world politics, we might say more often than sometimes, perhaps, don't you think? Because they symbolically represent, perhaps, the lower elements which mingle in the life force. All right, then, the last point I'd like to bring out then for tonight's class, and then next week we will take up the path that leads to Yesod there, the foundation, and show you just what the astral world really is supposed to be, what it has to do with our subconsciousness, and just what is involved in initiation, what it awakens and stirs and why, and how we can perhaps start the process now instead of later, so that when we do get to that stage in the chapter work, we'll be able to accomplish more than we would have otherwise. The point then I'd like to bring out as a last point for tonight, anyway, is this, that the linkage is made between the energy of each of the four worlds when one advances into the grade, that is, the Godhood, and everything is always started and finished in the name of the Holy Godhead. And although there are different names given to the Godhead of each of the Sephirith, remember it is all one God, and remember what we told you last week. God expresses in 10 outer spheres of activity, and the type of activity gives it a special name for the one God, merely indicating the activity of that one God in that area. And therefore the forces that are involved, awakening the forces of that level of God's selfhood in us. So the linkage is made, and it is because of this linkage in the advancements that one gets the intensified energies which hasten the evolution of the aspirant and bring, and actually the initiations or advancements through these grades cuts down the evolutionary level to a startling degree, sometimes where hundreds of incarnations could be involved. One can cut it down to a very few, provided one really sticks with the work, because one has the advantage of utilizing an energy because of the group vehicle that's involved as a chapter group, you see. The energies that one can utilize are so overwhelmingly more powerful than one can handle when one works alone, just at home. So overwhelmingly more powerful that this is the reason that the evolution can be hastened, and yet these very energies that are being handled is not just for the purpose of each of the aspirants and participants in this inner work. It's also so that there be a vehicle through which the inner school can send out evolutionary energy for the rest of the planet. And if one forgets that, one loses the real advantage of the work for one's own growth. So the linkage is, you see, what helps to wake up an awareness of what is called the consciousness of the elements. And this is what helps to break down our feeling of solidity in form. Because when you start becoming aware that everything that is, that this earth that you touch is living, that this flesh that you touch is living, that that rock that you touch, that stone, that creature, that it is living substance of God being held in a form because the central consciousness of God is expressing in and through that. You start breaking down that fixity in your consciousness that helps to open you up to all sorts of other things. And there is the value and the impact into subconsciousness through the ceremonial ritual brings that ability and capacity into focus and plants that seed. And so there, at least, we've covered the first vital step that takes place in chapter work of the true Rosicrucian paths of return. And then we'll now be able to start covering the other ones a little more rapidly. Before we close, I just want to bring out one more thing, and then we'll have our questions and answers. Remember, those 4 sephirot below the yellow one are all the powers of the personality. The yellow, the red, and the blue are the powers of the higher mind. And that above, the three supernals, these are the powers of the Spirit, the Godhead. Yet they're all the powers of the Godhead on different levels of self-expression. Then we'll go into more of which of the our faculties are involved in each of those next week. Now let's have some questions. Yes?
I heard a statement, well, I don't know how true it is, but it sounded extremely interesting to hear it. I'd like to pass it on. Someone made a statement to you, by concentrating on just God, the intention, the intangible God, by having the X-ray taken of the present moment, it sort of throws his backbone off.
Really?
Who that is, I don't know.
I don't know. I haven't ever heard that. I'd have to see the X-ray and know the person was meditating on God before I'd accept it. Yes.
I'm wondering, rather, I'd like to see you explain something, and that is, you mentioned before, representing personality.
Yes, the four Sephiroth below the yellow one. That is Malkos, which is the vehicle, and then the other three, the violet, the orange, and the green, which I'll discuss.
In ascending these paths,
yeah.
Isn't it the intensification that stirs certain emotions up so that they can be transmuted?
Yes, definitely. We'll go into that much more when we cover those parts of the... That's true. Yes.
Remember the question last week about what is soul and consciousness or that type of thing? I have a mental picture that I want to find out if it's all right to use. Because of past experience, I use the high, middle, and low self. And my middle self is my conscious mind. And I use a picture of a water fountain, like a bird bath. And the water in there is my conscious mind. And then as it overflows, it goes to my subconscious or my low self. And then that big cloud that's above where the water comes from is my soul or my high self that I share with everyone. Is that a good picture to use?
Well, it's not a bad picture to use, except that it has certain correlations with the way it actually functions. But the thing is, as you become familiar with the tarot keys and the tree, you will find you will have more effectiveness if you use the actual images that the tarot keys and the tree represent. For the various faculties, you'll find that you'll make headway a great deal more rapidly than with the image you hold, though the one you hold is all right. It certainly can help to set up more of a picture of the intangibility of certain elements.
Well, because of this picture, I've always felt and this in my mind, that my purpose was to get to know that nebulous, thing, that soul. Is that my purpose here? Our life?
Well, it's everyone's purpose, except that it's not so nebulous, which you will see when we go along with the tree. You see, we have an idea that it's nebulous, but it isn't that. And in actuality, when we're considering malkos, the one thing I didn't bring out, which I should, because that's one of the most important lessons of malkos, is that our job is to bring all the higher awarenesses into the physical body. In other words, what you call the soul, the spirit, our job is to bring it into the physical body, and in that way to make what we call the physical body the true vehicle for God, or the higher soul, the temple not made with hands, to make it the vehicle through which the higher self functions fully and completely. That is actually the purpose that all of us have. Yes?
The soul, when it wants to reincarnate and it determines what it's coming back for, chooses
if it has achieved that level of evolution.
Well, what I was wondering is that sometimes these souls that are attracted to parents where the birth is, or the conception is through accident or rape or war, what type of souls do these people draw to them?
That's a mistaken idea that a lot of people in metaphysics have had, that if a child is conceived through rape or through hatred or through various things, that it can't be a high soul. That in order to have a high soul, it has to be conceived in love. Actually, several of the most highly evolved souls I have ever known were certainly not conceived in love. One I know of was conceived in actual hatred. In fact, the father even tried to choke the mother to death because she wasn't feeling any welcoming attitude towards his amorous demands. And the result was a conception. It was really a rape with terrible hatred involved, and one of the most beautiful souls you can imagine was involved. And I know of many other such instances. It is a mistaken idea. Yes?
When you speak of conception of the two cells, is that the time that the soul takes over, or does the body create itself first and then conceive?
Well, there are different levels of the being. The actual higher soul doesn't really enter into the vehicle at all, incidentally, until the vehicle is grown into something pretty close to an adult. It's a gradual immersion. The parts of the soul that are the more automatic elements of the soul are always involved with growing the vehicle. But it's a gradual, you see, just like you can't put a quart of water into a pint cup. There's a thread with a direction that's involved in growing that vehicle while it's an embryo. But you haven't really, there's one part of the soul becomes a little more involved about the time of first movement. And even then it's just a small portion. And then at birth, there is a little bit more.
Is it more of a direction?
Yeah, there's a little bit more becomes involved. But if you will notice what barbarians, little children are, although we love them because we don't expect anything more of them, we figure it's okay for children to be that way. You can see that there's no higher soul bringing insights and understandings there. They can't because the vehicle isn't ready yet, you see. And so as the vehicle becomes more matured and ready, then more and more of the being can enter into and function through it. And indeed, there's a great part of our higher soul that never does get in or through the vehicle because we haven't evolved that much yet. You see, yeah, it's a projection of a more and more usage. There was some other hand there, somebody who had not yet asked a question. Well, in that case, I'll let...
Well, how do you explain a small child, that's clairvoyant, who can see, come up to you and say, "You're not feeling very well, I can see by your colors." How do you explain that?
Well, we have quite a few children who are quite psychic, and they lose it as they get a little older. As a matter of fact, all children are psychic, but they forget it, because some of them lose it a little sooner than others. But some children who are psychic keep the psychic quality. And I've known lots of children or people who were psychic as children, could see all kinds of things. In fact, were beaten or spanked for lying because of the things they were able to see. This is a matter of having the psychic faculty. It's not being psychic does not mean being spiritual, you see. I mean, a person could be psychic and also spiritual. And a person could be spiritual but not be psychic. However, being psychic does not make you spiritual, though it could go hand in hand. Why, there are lots of psychics who are the very reverse of spiritual. A great deal of misunderstanding. You'll understand that more, I think, after we have covered the the four parts of the personality, which involve the astral body, the mental body, and the desire body, you'll understand this a great deal better when we're through with that lower functions of the individual. Yes? Well, not exactly that. It is more like if you take water and you pour a lot of sugar into it. When you saturated it, melt it down, it'll start forming crystals. There you see nothing but water. And right out of nothing, you'll see crystals forming. Try it. It'll give you a better conception than anything. Seeing it come out of a fluid. And actually, the subtle part of consciousness is really fluidic when experienced by those who have seen it. Well, it's now time to say goodnight. We'll gather together next week and with some of you Sunday morning, and we'll continue with our adventure on the paths. And then I'll give you a technique next time, too, to help you. Good night. Hi,
Your newest member.
You better give it to my darling Eleanor there, because she takes care of those things. Well,
some of the people out in the desert wanted to know if they could get appointments to see you, just to talk to you about things, give you appointments.
Well, Eleanor gives all the consultations to tell them about things. I had to give that up because I was so busy with all the esoteric
Does it have chapters, say, all around? Do you have chapters in other towns?
No.
That's the only one.
The only place at the moment. I hope to have a couple more other places as soon as I've gotten enough of the group developed enough for it. But, okay, night time. Yeah, give it to Eleanor there. Yes, dear.
I wanted to ask you if you actually see what was ahead of you when you told me. Remember when you looked at my astrological thing and said you've been through hell but it's going to clear up. Did you actually see then what was going to happen to you?
Well, I don't see details. I saw that there were some higher intensive energies that were
that I had to go through hell again.
That's right. And the hell is all part of getting them. But they're on the way now, definitely.
Well, I went through the hell anyway.
So they're in process. The activity has started. I saw that.
I don't understand why I become emotional too,
because you're waking up to real livingness and being emotional.
Dearest, I'll meet you at.
All right, sweetheart.
Because again, I used to be that way, and then I got older.
And now you're going to get it back, only in a much nicer way.
Sure, will you give me something to work for?
Sure.
Thank you, dear.
You're welcome, darling. Hello, precious. How's my love? Hi. Good. Give the little one my love. And a great big kiss for me.